Good morning, y'all. Thank you again for joining us and for your patience this morning. I'm going to make this really quick so that we can get right to the content. But I just want to remind all of us that 2020 is a huge year in our country and in the state of California, particularly for the disability community, but also for the general public and for any community that is fighting for equity and justice. And so one of the ways that that this is a big year for us, of course, is the election, both the primary in March in California and then the general election in November. And so as the Disability Organizing Network, we inform and mobilize and organize people with disabilities and our allies around the state of California around issues that matter most to us. And this is a part of what we do around informing. We want to make sure that people with disabilities and our allies are informed about how what changes are happening this election, and so that we can be the most responsible and informed voters as possible. I also want to really thank our partners and presenters today, Paul and Gabe from Disability Rights California. We will also be hearing from some local organizers and advocates around the state, including Elizabeth Campbell Soper from Dale McIntosh Center and Brian Snyder from Freed Independent Living Center, and hopefully some of you all. So I'm just going to review what the presenters are going to remind us all today, which is, first of all, there are some new voting systems for us to be aware of, for us to tell our friends and family about. Then they're going to remind us about the Voters' Choice Act and why it matters to all of us. And then we're going to go a little bit into remote accessible vote by mail. That is, if for some of you who may be new to remote accessible vote by mail, that is another way that people with disabilities can vote in a way that may be more accessible to them. Then we'll be going over primary election rules and then point you in the direction of amazing resources, and of course the Disability Organizing Network and Disability Rights California are here for you as well. So with that being said, I will pass it over to Paul and Gabe from Disability Rights California. And please, I encourage all of you to ask your questions throughout the presentation, and we will be going until we'll stay as close to on time as possible, even with the late start, and so we'll be going until about 11:30. So thank you all again.
Hey, good morning. This is Paul Spencer with Disability Rights California.
And this is Gabe Taylor, also with Disability Rights California.
So Gabe and I, we work to make sure the voting is accessible for people with disabilities statewide. We're excited to give you all the presentation and kind of give you an overview of the changes that you and your consumers might see. And we'll go into detail where we can. And as Ali said, please chip in with questions wherever you like. But just to kind of give you a quick little overview, I mean, here's the big first one is that the primary election is March 3rd. Usually our primary election is in June, so it moved up. I think Gabe and I, when we talk to people pretty frequently, people are like, oh, it's in March, so that's just kind of a big one to kind of run by people, is to make sure they realize it's coming up in March. In some ways, the job's a little easier because this is going to be how do we put it, Gabe, an exciting election?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's mostly just making sure that everybody has, one of the big focuses for Paul and I is to make sure that people are just aware of the changes, and so they can feel a little bit more prepared when they start receiving information in their voter information packets, or if they live in a county that will be changing the way they do voting, that they won't be caught off guard if they receive things in the mail that they weren't expecting. So,
and also the other thing too, like Gabe and I, we're always trying to make sure that people are, aware of what the rules are for accessibility in elections. That elections are accessible. People with disabilities should be able to vote privately and independently. So this presentation doesn't really go into that, but we have some resources on our disabilityrightsca.org website. And we have resources that kind of go over the accessibility protections. But, if anyone has some accessibility questions, please feel free to jump in. Speaking of accessibility, all polling locations and vote centers have to have an accessible voting system, at least one, for people with disabilities to use. The one kind of new thing is in this March election, all the counties in California are going to have new voting equipment. So about 20 counties, they got it in the last couple of years, but about 30 got new voting equipment just in the last year, which is a good thing for accessibility. So a lot of times, a lot of advocates, you see in your counties, you've had really old accessibility equipment, which has been a pretty constant barrier. It's not, it's buggy, it's hard to use. I mean, if you're not familiar with it, imagine, trying to troubleshoot a computer from 2010. It's pretty hard, or troubleshooting a computer even from 2002. It gets weird. So we're going to show you some images too and kind of explain what the new voting equipment looks like, but it depends county to county. Another thing is we're going to talk a lot about the Voters' Choice Act in this presentation. And we'll talk about whether or not you're in a VCA county or Voters' Choice Act county, but it's still kind of important you pay attention even if you're not in a VCA county, and we'll kind of get into that. And the last thing is, the voting's coming up fast. Vote centers are going to open up on February 22nd. And a lot of county election offices, they'll be opening up in early February for voting. So it's coming and ballots are going out soon. So this is just some other things to review. E-poll books. We're not going to go really quickly into what e-poll books are, but typically when you walk into a polling location, you check in, there's the poll book, which is the paper book, and the election worker, they find your name, and you sign next to your name, and that's what a poll book is. So e-poll books are like a tablet version of those. So some counties are going to have that. It's just something to make voters aware of when they walk in. And also the two in-person voting systems, so the accessible voting equipment, there's most counties have these two companies, Dominion and Hart, and we'll show you some pictures next. But then the last other big change we want to talk about is conditional voter registration. It's a mouthful, but basically what same-day conditional voter registration is it allows you to register to vote up until election day. So this is new and kind of a big one, and we're going to touch on it more in this presentation. But in the past, you had to register before the deadline. Otherwise, if you missed the deadline, you weren't able to vote. Now with conditional voter registration, everything's the same until you get 14 days away from the election. In the past, if you got to that 14-day mark and you weren't registered, you weren't going to be able to participate. Now, after that 14 days, you can go register to vote in person at polling locations, vote centers, and at the county election office. So, I think this is just an important voter protection, and also, if you run into someone that's not registered to vote. Before we go to the next slide, the equipment, there's one thing. So we're going to come back to conditional voter registration because it matters when we talk about the rules for what party you need to be in to vote for a presidential candidate. We saved those slides for the end of the presentation, so definitely save your brain power for the end. It's something that we all need to be able to explain, and I think Gabe and I are still we're getting better at being able to explain it and not either put people to sleep or get ourselves confused.
Right.
So we'll save those for the end. But let's move to the next slide, and we're going to look at some pictures of voting equipment. So when you walk into your polling location or vote center, the majority of counties in California are going to have this system on the left, the Dominion system. So I'm going to explain what this looks like. So the Dominion looks like a really big iPad for the screen, which is a touch screen, the big one. It's vertically mounted. And then it has, Gabe, what's the controller called again? The accessible controller?
The keypad?
It has a keypad. But,
yeah.
but not a keypad with an actual keyboard. It just has like the accessible left, right, up, down, and a selection arrow. And those keypads are pretty good actually for access.
It also has adjustments for volume control to increase or decrease the volume.
And it has a speed control too, right? A tactile speed control in it. Yeah, which is a cool feature.
And also it has input for folks who may use sip and puff devices, or if they have any sort of paddle switch technology, it allows somebody to be able to plug in to be able to use that and navigate through their ballot.
And there's also headphones on there too, so you get audio as well. And I believe you can invert the colors on this. So the Dominion system, the reason we're kind of focusing on is this is the most common one in California, so it's probably the one you're most likely to see in your county. And then it also prints out a paper ballot, and then that paper ballot is what's submitted. So it's another thing too, how most of you all on this call know this. I mean, there's no internet or online voting. I mean, what these systems do is they're basically marking a paper ballot. You can think about this as a really fancy way to accessibly mark a piece of paper. So a lot of times these devices are just called ballot marking devices. And, you know, essentially that's what they are. I mean, these are devices that, you know, mark a piece of paper, and then that piece of paper is turned in just like a paper ballot. So in the picture, there's also a printer to the right of the screen. Also, these systems, they don't count votes. That's why they print out a paper ballot, and that's what's counted later, typically at the county election office. So let's talk about the other system on the right, the HART InterCivic Verity 3.1. You know, it has a screen. It's displayed in its carry box, and it also has a printer. So this system is it uses a paddle wheel, like a click paddle wheel, which you would have had on an old school iPod. I think that's the best way to describe it, right, Gabe?
Yeah, that's the closest control similarity I could think of.
I don't even know if people even remember what iPods are anymore. It's been a long time for me, but it basically has a click wheel like an iPod. It's accessible. It's passed all the requirements. Only a handful of counties use HART, so it's less common.
And one of the things that you can't, it's hard to tell from the picture, but that little control pad actually comes out of the unit itself. So if somebody needs to, you know, put it on their lap, or they need to be able to pull it closer to them, that's something that it can do.
And let's talk about the good news of these systems. So for people with disabilities that come in to vote in person, these things are a lot more user-friendly for the voters, and that these are more akin to like modern technology that we're used to using, especially the Dominion system. It's more like an iPad. And the other big thing is, you know, humans run elections. So we have poll workers and vote center workers, and it's a lot easier to maintain and troubleshoot these systems than the old stuff that this equipment replaced. And, you know, Gabe and I, we run a hotline on election day, and one of our most common calls is the accessible voting system isn't working at my polling location. And that's typically because the equipment's just old and buggy. But now we have new equipment, so our Gabe and I's hope is that elections are more accessible, and we're going to see this when we have far less hotline calls about accessible equipment. So that's what I really hope happens in March, but we'll see.
And then, the other thing too, I was just going to add, because these are they're very new systems, and you know, they haven't been used in previous elections. One of the things that the counties are trying to do more of, the county election staff, are demonstrations for different groups and different organizations. So if your organization, if you think your clients or consumers might benefit from having like an in-person demonstration, or maybe gathering a group to scheduling a time to go to your county elections office and have a demonstration, many of the county elections offices are open to doing that. So you can just, you know, maybe contact your county elections the registrar's office and see about setting something like that up.
I love doing presentations when a county comes and brings voting equipment because it's just better.
Yeah.
People can use the equipment afterwards. Most counties have never been asked to do this, so you're just going to have to ask. And then also, if you have them come out, tell them to bring at least 2 systems so people don't have to wait. And even 3 or 4 or 5 can be pretty awesome because that way people aren't having to wait after your presentation to use the equipment. But that's a really good point, Gabe. Yeah, it's awesome when counties will bring this equipment out. And then real quick before we go to the next slide, LA County has a different type of voting equipment. So if you're in LA, you'll see something different. It's a little beyond the scope of this presentation, but LA also has new accessible voting equipment, which is, I guess you could say, somewhat similar to the Dominion system on the left. It's got a big touch screen.
Yeah, big touch screen, and it has a control panel or control pad that you can also sort of pull closer to you. They're in the process of certification for that system, so it's not official yet, but they are moving forward, and it's been in the works for about over 10 years now, the design process. So they're coming towards the tail end of that whole journey for them. So
okay, and last point with the voting equipment, it's always important, always remind people, every polling location and vote center is going to have an accessible voting system. It's state and federal law, but I'd say the general public awareness that those are there pretty low. Voters' Choice Act. So we're going to kind of cover it over pretty quickly. So if you're one of the participants and you look through this list of 14 counties and you don't see your county, avoid the temptation to tune out, because it's still important even if you're not in one of these counties, because lots of us have clients that might live in another county. And also, if you look at these counties that are doing the Voters' Choice Act, so Sacramento, Los Angeles, Orange County, these are big media markets. So if you live in a county outside of these areas, your neighbors, your consumers, they're still going to hear ads about the Voters' Choice Act. So you need to be aware of what it is, how it works. So even if you don't live in a VCA county. So these are so 5 counties did this in 2018, and then there's going to be 9 more in 2020. So all these counties are doing the Voters' Choice Act again. Real quick, let's do a poll. Oh, I'm actually going to go ahead and read the counties out to you for you folks. So the 2018 ones are Madera, Napa, Nevada, Sacramento, San Mateo. So they did it in 2018, and they're going to do it again in 2020. And then the new counties are El Dorado, Fresno, Los Angeles, Mariposa, Orange, Santa Clara, Amador, Butte, and Tuolumne. So we have a poll question because we're just kind of curious if whether or not, so there's a poll question that's coming up, whether or not you live in one of these VCA counties. So if everyone could go ahead and answer the poll for us, that'd be awesome.
So if you live in one of these counties, go ahead and select yes on the poll. So the counties are Madera, Napa, Nevada, Sacramento, San Mateo, and then new ones for this year are El Dorado, Fresno, Los Angeles, Mariposa, Orange, Santa Clara, Amador, Butte, or Tuolumne. So if you're in any of those counties, go ahead and let us know by selecting yes. If you're not, go ahead and select the no button. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. And you guys, it looks like we have about 39% of people on the call today are in one of these 14 counties. That's actually a pretty good percentage. And then 61% of you are not in one of these counties listed. So thank you for your participation.
Okay, so let's stay on this slide real quick, and we're just going to cover the basic difference between the Voters' Choice Act and other counties. So in a Voters' Choice Act county, everyone gets sent a vote by mail ballot, whether or not you're signed up for vote by mail. So everyone automatically gets a vote by mail ballot. And then instead of neighborhood polling locations, there's vote centers. So we'll talk about how many vote centers there are, but in a small county like Madera County, there's 4 or 5 vote centers. And then in a really large county like Los Angeles, there might be 1,000 vote centers. But basically, there's one vote center for every 10 to 50,000 voters. A vote center is basically a really big polling location. The other thing is the Voters' Choice Act requires community input on the election plan, and there's also some other really good protections for voters with disabilities. But that's the real nutshell Voters' Choice Act. With a quick caveat is that LA County has its own modified version of the Voters' Choice Act. So all voters don't get a vote by mail ballot, but there's going to be more vote centers per number of voters in the county. So there'll be a denser amount of vote centers. This is also sort of a big deal. 1 in 4 voters in California live in LA. There's a lot there. LA also has a new voting system. So it's a little different in LA County, but typically though, everyone's going to get, in the other 13 counties, they're all going to get a vote by mail ballot, and vote centers will be open from starting 10 days before the election. So that's LA. Let's kind of go to the next slide and we'll talk about some of the voting options. So, one cool thing about the Voters' Choice Act is there's 11 days of in-person voting. And this is a big one. Voters can go to any vote center in the county and vote the ballot. So the way it works right now, if you don't go to your neighborhood polling location, if you go to another location, in a traditional election, you can still vote, but you're not going to be able to vote your actual ballot with all of the races that you're eligible to vote in. But in a Voters' Choice Act county, it's pretty cool. You can go to any vote center in the county. So, especially if you commute 45 minutes to work, you can vote there. You don't have to vote at home. A lot of that's really convenient. It's also good for accessibility in the sense that, especially if you ride public transportation, you just have a lot more options of going somewhere to vote in person, especially if you need to vote in person because you want to use an accessible voting system. Vote centers, some counties sort of advertise them as how do they put it, Gabe? A voter assistance center, because there's a lot of workers there. You can get questions answered. You could just even drop off your completed vote by mail ballot. The other thing about vote centers, and this is a good reminder for folks that don't live in Voters' Choice Act counties, is that these are some of the accessibility requirements that are there when you go to vote in person. These are at polling locations. They're also at vote centers. So curbside voting is still an option. You can have a ballot brought out to your car if you're a person with a disability. There's other assistive devices there like ball grips, magnifying sheets, a signature guide will be at in-person locations.
Yeah.
The other thing, go ahead, Gabe, sorry.
I was just going to say, yeah. We're talking specifically about the vote centers, but all of these things are automatic things that should be provided regularly at a polling place, at an already established polling place. So like Paul said, if you don't live in a VCA, even if you don't live in a VCA county, accommodations like this should be available to you.
Yeah. And also, poll workers and vote center workers, they are supposed to receive training on working with voters with disabilities. The one thought in Voters' Choice Act counties, since they have to hire less election workers generally, that they're able to give them more training. So for example, in Sacramento, instead of a one-day training that poll workers typically get, their Voters' Choice Act workers are getting up to 3 days of training. So the idea is, that they're better able to serve the needs of people with disabilities. And, for example, in Sacramento, they get a full dedicated session to using the accessible voting equipment. Whereas in a lot of counties, for those of you that have done poll worker training, it's a slog. You get through it. And then typically at the end, when you're the most tired, they give you a training on the election equipment. So that's one other nice thing about the Voters' Choice Act. Just kind of more of like what's in a vote center. There's 3 accessible voting machines. So when you walk into a vote center, you're going to see at least 3 of those Dominion machines or 3 of those Hart machines. Also at the vote center, you can register to vote. You can drop off your ballot. You can get a ballot replacement. And as we talked about, you can vote at any vote center in the county. These are things that are very voter friendly. There is a big negative that we'll talk about in a couple slides, but this is something, and also we're going to go into how the communities can provide input on where these vote centers should be. So that's another nice thing. I mean, traditionally in elections, like, you don't have much say on where your polling location is going to go, but the Voters' Choice Act actually gives you that voice. So some more, just another next slide, just some more logistics about how many vote centers there are. So 10 days before the election, there's one vote center for every 50,000 voters. And then 3 days before the election, so you got 4 days to vote in, there's a vote center for every 10,000 voters. They're just open for normal business hours. And then, on election day, they're open from the traditional time, which is 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. One note for people that, if you're in a really small county that has less than 50,000 voters, they'll have a minimum of 2 vote centers, which is nice as well. But let's kind of talk about one downside of vote centers. We'll go to the next slide. So, you don't have those really convenient local polling locations. So in a VCA county, voters with disabilities will not have the convenience of we call it hyper-local polling places. So you might have to travel a little farther, which, that's not good, especially if you ride public transportation. You might have to go a little farther. Ideally, that's offset by, placing the vote centers, thinking about where people with disabilities live and public transportation, and then also they're open for longer hours. But, this is one thing to be aware of, especially if you're a person with a disability or you're advising someone with a disability that needs to vote in person so they can use the accessible voting equipment. This is a challenge of the Voters' Choice Act. So it's one thing to be aware of. But let's kind of move on now to the community input portion of the VCA. I'm going to kind of pass the baton to Gabe.
And hi, Paul. This is Allie. We just have 2 quick questions that have come through, and actually a third from me. I just want to make sure everyone understands. So the first question was from Jamie. How can we become a VCA county?
So becoming a VCA county is up to your county election officials, and it's also up to typically the Board of Supervisors in a county, because the Board of Supervisors is who approves the additional funding that they're going to need to become a Voters' Choice Act county. So, Jamie, it depends sometimes on the rules and the politics of individual counties, and there's 58 counties, but typically the counties, and this is the other 14 counties, is that, the election officials might want to do this, and then they'll submit a proposal to their Board of Supervisors, and the Board of Supervisors will vote on whether or not to approve the additional funding. So that's typically how it works. It has been like all local political decisions. There's definitely contentious in some counties about whether or not to do the Voters' Choice Act. One issue is that the idea, I think one of the lofty goals of the Voters' Choice Act is that, it'll save money over time. For example, because you're not having thousands of polling locations, you're having, just a handful of vote centers. Should be cheaper. But initially, you got to buy new equipment, you got to do a lot of training. So there's upfront costs, and, typically the county Board of Supervisors are who controls the purse strings. So they sort of control whether or not to become a VCA county. But Jamie, I'd just like to end on, if your county is thinking about becoming a Voters' Choice Act county for the elections in 2022, you should definitely participate in that process. You're welcome to go give a comment at a Board of Supervisors meeting, write a letter to the paper about whether or not you think your county should do the Voters' Choice Act. And I can answer the next question. And Jamie, I apologize, that was probably the wordiest answer you ever expected for whether or not your county can become a Voters' Choice Act county. That's just something Gabe and I have been really thinking about for the last, years now, Gabe, about which counties are doing the Voters' Choice Act, why they're going to do it, because it's, it really matters. We're trying to plan our internal logistics for how, these counties meet their accessibility requirements. So it's, I don't know, it's been somewhat stressful about whether or not counties do the Voters' Choice Act or not for us. So
I go into a little bit more in detail in the next part of the PowerPoint, or the presentation. But one of the things that's also a huge part of it is getting organizations and sites to buy into this idea that they could maybe be a potential vote center, and explaining to them what all is involved with that. And so, you know, a lot of it, as Paul said, is making those connections to your community partners and being able to connect with people and not only get them educated, but also get them to collaborate with you. So, but we'll go into a little bit more in detail in just a few.
And we have one other question: is Stanislaus County doing the Voters Choice Act county? So Stanislaus is not doing it in 2020, but you know they might do it in the future. So it's just one thing to kind of keep on your radar, and you know, especially if you're a local advocate, you know, you might want to have relationships with your election office so you can kind of feel them out where they're not going to do the Voters Choice Act. But just to give Gabe an awesome intro to doing community input on the VCA, you know, go ahead.
And Paul, I just want to reiterate, because we do, you know, more than half of our participants are not in a VCA county. So can you just remind people as we continue to move forward why talking about the VCA is relevant for all of us?
Sure. So, you know, the Voters' Choice Act has a big impact on people with disabilities in that, you know, you're losing your neighborhood polling location, but you're gaining some other things. And one big thing that I think you're gaining in the Voters' Choice Act county is the county is required to have committees, workshops, and outreach for the disability community. So that to me is a big pro for doing the Voters' Choice Act. So, you know, perhaps you live in a county, like I live in San Diego County, there's good committees and things for voters with disabilities without the Voters' Choice Act, but you know, it can be one way to make your election office do more outreach to the disability community. So that could be one reason you might be interested in whether or not your county is going to do the Voters' Choice Act. But so Gabe's going to kind of talk now about one really cool thing about the VCA is this community input aspect.
Yeah. So, and Ali, I'll just add a little thing. We were having a conversation about this a couple days ago, that one of the things that's hard especially if you are in one of the Southern California counties that aren't doing VCA, i.e. like Riverside County or San Bernardino County, you still live in an area that if you're driving around in your car and you're listening to KNX 1070 radio, you may hear a story about, the vote center site locations, or, being automatically mailed your vote by mail ballot. And so it's going to be very, very important for this ongoing conversation and dialogue to happen with your clients or consumers or other community partners if you don't live in a VCA county, just to make sure that people are getting the correct information that applies to them. So, one of the big things that's really, really going to be important, as we've sort of said it in a lot of different ways, is the active participation by all of you, because you go to your community meetings, you are on different county committees, you do presentations and trainings to partnering organizations and groups of clients and consumers. And so odds are that if they haven't heard about the Voters' Choice Act yet, they will. And so making sure that folks have a good, you're able to talk with them about it if they have questions, or if you don't have the answers to their particular questions, being able to direct people to the most helpful resources. So,
Gabe, this is
yes.
Megan. It looks like we have someone raising their hand to ask a question. Are you guys okay taking that right now?
Sure.
Perfect. Sheila, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. So go ahead and ask the question to us.
Anyway, okay. So I'm late because I didn't receive the ding dong, because I registered late. But my question is whether Alameda is one of the counties that's doing this VCA thing or not.
Alameda is not one of the counties currently. So they might choose to do it in the future, but it's not happening for the elections in 2020.
Great. Thank you, guys.
So we touched on it a little bit. I think Paul in his discussion mentioned some of the community meetings that have taken place in some of the counties that have already gone towards the Voters' Choice Act or will be implementing it this year. But those are really great opportunities for community advocates to be involved, because this is the one opportunity where you can provide suggestions on where you think good locations would be for vote centers and drop box locations. So for example, in both LA and Orange County, they had a section of their website where interested people could go and offer suggestions, and they could just input whether it was a business or a residence or a library or a community center. They were able to put that in as a suggestion into a database portal on the county election site. And what the counties do is they go in and they take all of the suggestions that have been given, and then they consider them, and they often will go out to those locations and see if they are workable locations, whether or not they have enough space and whether or not they're accessible. Because that's one of the big things that's really important about all of the vote center locations, is that they need to be accessible for voters with disabilities. So that's one of the things that they go out and they do these site visits to make sure that all of these locations will be locations that a voter with a disability can get to. So, and so it's that's a really great opportunity. And the other thing that's also really helpful is when the counties get to the point where they have to put together an official plan on how the election will work, how all of the different steps and stages will work, and they have to make that public. So what they do is they put it all together. They get a lot of community feedback, and in LA County and also Orange County, they hosted multiple community meetings where members of the public could come and provide some feedback or suggestions, and on things that they would like to see, locations that they think would be helpful. It's also a great opportunity for the folks to be able to get information that they can then share with their clients and consumers. So each county does it a little bit differently. Some host multiple meetings. Others will host maybe just one or two. So they talk about all of the voting options and the different thing, all of the changes. And so they're required to at least have one workshop that is directed for all of the languages that are covered in that specific county. And then they are also required to have a workshop for people with disabilities. So they will, and they usually designate so people will know if they have if they're from bilingual community, or if they are a voter with a disability. They'll know that this is that they have a specific meeting that is scheduled that will cover information that relates specifically to their particular needs. So, and I wanted to also at this point bring Brian and Russell in, because one of the things that they were really helpful in early on. So Brian up in Nevada County and Russell in Sacramento were really great in sort of mobilizing a lot of community members and community partners and consumers to get to some of those early meetings. So I don't know if you all, if Brian and Russell, if you can share a little bit about some of the experience that you had sort of outreaching to community partners.
Who would you like to go first?
Brian, if you want to chime in, that's fine. And then Russell.
Hello, this is Brian from Freed Center for Independent Living in Grass Valley. As Paul mentioned earlier about brain power, I apologize. I used mine up about a year and a half ago. So you just bear with me. In any case, yeah, what we did was we formed the Future Elections of Nevada County Coalition. And that coalition was comprised of Freed, of course, the League of Women Voters of Western Nevada County, Sierra Fund, Partners in English Language Learning, Truckee Family Resource Center. And we started early on and just started collaborating and seeing how we could outreach to our target audience or audiences, and which were older adults, people with disabilities, and Spanish-speaking community members. And what we did was actually the first major initiative we did was we created actually a video that explained the Voters' Choice Act, and we had two different videos, one that was English and one in Spanish with Spanish captions, and that was played on our local community access TV station. It was also on YouTube, and we posted it on Facebook, and it actually got quite a few views, around almost 4,000. And so that was one of our major outreach events. And it was also played at candidate forums in the beginning. Janice Bedane of the League of Women Voters and myself, we introduced the video, discussed the Voters' Choice Act, fielded questions from the audience after the video was shown. And so, yeah, we did a lot of, we tried to just reach everybody we could, either through the videos or through literature, or going to assisted living facilities, skilled nursing facilities, and just kind of just introduce ourselves, hand out the pamphlets for the Voters' Choice Act. And by the end of it, by this, I guess it was the end of 2018, people were saying, we're talking about what are we going to do in 2019? And the consensus was that everybody in the county says, it's enough already with the Voters' Choice Act. We get it. We get it. So I think the mission was accomplished because we did not receive any complaints through the county. And we did not, Freed didn't, I kept checking to see if we had any messages about issues with voting, and I don't believe that we received any. And so it seems to be going smoothly as far as we can tell. The only downfall is we were not able to reach as many Spanish-speaking community members as we would have liked to. And we did the best we could, both the elections department and our community partners, as well as trying to reach marginalized community members. And so I believe that is it. Does that sound right? Is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that gives a great overview. And Russell, if you have any sort of experiences that were particular to Sacramento County and everything that you did, whether or not it was reaching community partners or or working with consumers, that would be helpful, and sort of how to get them engaged.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Brian. A lot of what happened in Nevada County also happened here in Sacramento County. I was fortunate and attended our first VAC, Voter Accessibility Advisory Commission meeting, and was brought into the committee early on, and saw a lot of the partnerships that Brian had mentioned. One of the things that was really important, I think, here in Sacramento is that there was a proposed vote center location that had accessibility issues. It was not meeting the state standard set forth by SB 450 for a vote center. There were issues with the exterior of the building, access, and the county elections office and the VAC, we worked together to identify the issues, and ultimately made the decision at that time to not have it be a vote center. It was a difficult decision. We were able to find an alternate location in a nearby town, but given that this was a very rural community, was very challenging. However, I'm excited to say that because of the work that we did, the fact that there was the barriers, and that we were able to maintain in constant contact with the Board of Supervisors and the community in Ileton, that we are able to announce that Ileton will be a vote center in this upcoming election. So we're really excited to hear that. That's all work that came about, though, through the work of the VAC. So, you know, the vote center model is very different, but there are so many pieces of the law that require additional standards on accessibility. In fact, just last night at the Sacramento County Disability Advisory Commission meeting, our registrar of voters was talking to the Disability Advisory Committee about the changes and some of the new access. And it's interesting because all of that conversation used to just be a small piece of the DAC's purview, but now it's its own commission. So the Voter Accessibility Advisory Commission is really powerful tool. And I encourage, even if you don't have a VAC or you're not a VCA county, you can start building the community connections that Brian was talking about with other organizations. And I think that's really powerful. There was one here that was built called the Sacramento Vote Coalition. So those are the highlights. I think there are many other reasons to get involved. It's a good way to get out into the community and meet with people and talk with them about voting.
Great. Thank you both for sharing a little bit about the experiences.
May I interject one last thing?
Sure.
One of the things that I remember hearing on our Do Network calls is issues with advocates and organizers having difficulty connecting with their elections department. And one of the things that I think was crucial in terms of forming a relation with elections department was Paul Spencer. He came up to our VAC meetings and kind of reinforced his presence there to keep the conversation on track with regards to making sure everybody was in compliance with the Voters' Choice Act. And so I would encourage advocates and organizers to call upon Gabe or Paul if they're having any issues with elections departments in their counties, to they can, kind of facilitate a dialogue. And I think through that, it really helped our county, Nevada County, because in the beginning, we weren't sure how to communicate with them. And, because I just didn't want to bother them to some extent. But on the other hand, that relationship grew, and now they're reaching out to us all the time. And so I think in order to make things smooth for everyone and inclusive, I think it's really important to reach out to Gabe or Paul, and if there's any issues with connecting with your elections department in your counties. Over. Thank you.
Yeah, and Brian, this is Paul. I totally agree. Gabe and I are always happy to help in any of the other counties, especially if you're looking to start some of these committees for voters with disabilities that we're going to talk about next. Brian, you've done an exceptional job, building a coalition, which is just ongoing work. It's keeping people interested. It's sending out agendas, which you've done a great job with, and it's establishing relationships with the election office. And Brian, I think as you've discovered, I've discovered in other counties, that especially as county election officials are trying to do a better job meeting the accessibility requirements, it really helps to have an expert like you, Brian, to call and ask. And also regular meetings, helps keep everybody on track. And yeah, and then Russell, I like the contrast between Russell and Brian too. So in Sacramento, there's been a little bit more longstanding, committees for people with disabilities. But, as Russell you talked about, ran into a really sticky issue where the county wanted to use a vote center that wasn't accessible. Russell did some great advocacy work to make sure that didn't happen. So it's just, Russell had the relationships to, be nimble and find a solution, which is great.
Yeah.
But probably the big thing is we're going to talk about in these VACs in the next couple slides is these are kind of a good way to get your foot in the door and kind of get the ball rolling on accessibility. And even if the slide doesn't make it abundantly clear, and we'll talk about it, you don't have to be a BCA county to have these committees. And one way to think about the Voters' Choice Act is that disability advocates got a whole lot of best practices for making elections accessible added into the Voters' Choice Act. So there are requirements for the VCA counties, but there's still best practices that other counties can adopt. And for example, Sacramento and Nevada County, before they started the VCA, they formed these committees, which is a good practice, especially if you're one of those folks that's in another county that's thinking about doing the VCA. It's a good time to get the VAC rolling or to go ahead and join. Wait, Gabe, I'm sorry, I have one last thing to say for Russell and Brian, just so Russell, Brian, and DRC, our organizations collaborated with the Sacramento Elections Office on making a PSA video on vote centers. So it's on our YouTube channel if you want to check it out. Russell and Brian are both in the videos, and it's just a really cool collaboration because we had two nonprofits, we had an election office, and we had DRC, another nonprofit, made this really cool thing, and you can see how we all collaborated to do it. I think the video is pretty good, and Russell and Brian are in it, and Gabe's even narrating it. So it's definitely something to check out on our YouTube channel.
Yes, for sure.
Thank you, Russell and Brian. I appreciate you both.
Thank you. The feeling is mutual.
Yes, just again, it speaks to the power and the gift that collaborating together can really bring. And also just to touch on it a little bit, the really great thing about these VACs, and we'll kind of briefly touch on VACs and then move on to the next topic of remote accessible vote by mail. The really good thing about these committees is they're the local voice. So because Paul and I, we go to a lot of the VACs, but we may not live in that specific county. So we don't know the ins and outs of different organizations and different public transportation routes. And so having that involvement and that engagement from local community members is really important because the community, the local voice are the voices of the people that know what works and what doesn't on a day-to-day basis. And so it's really, really crucial to get those voices to the table, almost as important as any sort of accessibility experts or sort of outside voices that would be coming in to provide input. So
also, Gabe, just for an example, I think this was at a Sacramento VAC meeting, and someone was talking about a public transportation route, but Russell was able to point out that yes, this route was there, but practically, if you're a person with a disability, it really doesn't take you where it needs to go. So like Russell had that like on the ground local experience that really informed the discussion of where they were going to place vote centers. So,
right.
This is Allie. Hi y'all. I'm so glad we're that I'm really hoping that folks on the webinar are able to get a sense of the opportunities available in their local counties, whether or not they have adopted the Voters' Choice Act. Due to time and all of the important content in today's webinar, I'm gonna request that anyone who is interested in, who is not already involved in their local voting accessibility advisory committee, or maybe your county doesn't have one, but you want to get involved and maybe help get one started, I'm going to ask that we move forward to the remote accessible vote by mail, and that for anyone who wants to get that information and get involved, to contact us directly. You can put it through the webinar evaluation, or you can email us, and we can get you connected to the advocacy that is so necessary across the state. And so thank you so much, and thank you.
Sure. Yeah, well,
keep it moving, Alan. You hired two epic talkers to do a presentation.
Right, yeah. But you got to keep us on task for sure. So I will go in. I'll touch some on the remote accessible vote by mail. So for any of you all that haven't heard of this as an option, it's an option primarily for people with disabilities. And what it does is it allows a voter to mark and review and then print out a ballot using their home computers. And oftentimes, if you use any sort of assistive devices on your home computers, it allows you to do that from the comfort and privacy of your home. And then all counties are offering this option, and they are including a prepaid envelope. So you'll be able to mark your ballot, review it, and then once you print it out using your home computer and your printer, you can then mail it back in. Or if you're, you want to drop it off, you can always do that. But they do provide a prepaid envelope for you to be able to just send it back in via mail. So how does it work? So you have to, because it's a service that is primarily provided for voters with disabilities, and it's also, it's available for anybody, but it's primarily geared to be an accommodation for a voter with a disability. You have to contact your county elections office to be able to get the application to become a remote accessible vote by mail voter. And you can do that through by phone, by email, or oftentimes, depending on your county, they'll have a link on their website that you can go to that will allow you to print out the application form. So once the request is received by your county elections office, they will email you a link to the remote accessible vote by mail. So you'll receive that in your email. So if that's something you're interested in doing, be sure that you're giving them an active and frequently used email address, just so you can be sure to get it. So once you do that, you'll get a link that will have all of your, you'll be able to enter all of your voter information into a secured portal. And it will also ask you to affirm that you are in fact a voter with a disability. It doesn't ask what your specific disability is. It just wants you to acknowledge that you in fact are, you do have a disability. So then it will download the specific ballot type and any additional information like instructions on how to mark and return the ballot. And oftentimes you'll see it'll come in a little folder, and it'll designate the folder that explains instructions, and then there'll be an icon that will oftentimes, you can click on it, it'll direct you right to the ballot. So like we mentioned, the voter is able to use their assistive technology, whatever that happens to be, from your home computer, to complete and mark your choices on your ballot. And as Paul mentioned earlier, we have a video on our YouTube page. So go to type into the YouTube. You can just do Disability Rights California Remote Accessible Vote by Mail, and you should be able to call up the video, and it gives you a step-by-step of what the process looks like. And then once you complete it, you are able to print out your ballot, and that includes the choices that you've made, and then place it in the envelope. And the envelope, you can then you have to sign the envelope to verify that you have completed it, and you can, as I said, either return it by mail, drop it off at one of the many Dropbox locations, or go to any polling place or vote center by 8 p.m. on election day. So you're also able to, you can check the status of your ballot as well.
All right. Okay, so we saved this one for the end. We only have 2 slides left. But so for the March primary, normally, in California, it's a top 2. It doesn't really matter what party you're in for what you're voting for. However, it's different for the presidential primary. So let's just do the easy part first. So if you're already registered with a political party, you'll get that party's ballot with their presidential candidates. So that's pretty normal. That, if you're in a party, you're going to vote for those parties' candidates. So if you want to vote for a candidate in another party, you're going to need to re-register with that party. So just kind of linking back to what we were talking about with conditional voter registrations, that that registration deadline's not quite as serious anymore, but you should still do this ahead of time. Otherwise, it's going to be inconvenient because you're going to have to go re-register in person. You also want to make sure you're re-registered before vote by mail ballots go out, because if you get a vote by mail ballot, you might get the wrong one. So again, let's just go back to this easy part. If you're already in a party and you want to vote for that party's presidential candidates, that's what you're going to get. You don't really need to do anything different. If you are nonpartisan or independent, so what this is called in California officially is no party preference. So some people call it decline to state. Think about it as nonpartisan or independent. So, if you are no party preference, you're not going to see the presidential race on the primary election ballot at all. So it'll just be blank. It won't be there. So to vote for that, you've got to do something else. If you're a so again, if you are registered as nonpartisan, if you're registered as no party preference, which is what it's officially called in California, like what we, informally call independent. But if you're registered as no party preference and you want to vote for in the presidential primary, you got to do something a little different. And I lied to you all. We actually have 3 slides on this topic. So this is kind of breaking it down by party. So, if you're in the American Independent, Democratic, or Libertarian Party, if these are the parties that are allowing nonpartisan voters to cross over and vote for their presidential candidates, but you've got to let your election office know that you want a crossover ballot from one of these parties. So again, just to kind of summarize, you can be a no party preference, and if you request the ballot, you can vote in American Independent, Democrat, or Libertarian parties for their presidential candidates. So in the next bullet point, it's the Green Party, the Peace and Freedom Party, and the Republican Party are not allowing no party preference voters to vote for their presidential candidates. You actually have to be registered in one of these parties. So if you want to vote in the Green Party for their presidential candidates, you actually need to re-register in the Green Party. That's kind of what it comes down to. For most people, you're the party you're in, that's who you're voting for, things are fine. But a lot of people in California are no party preference. So you need to be aware of these rules so you don't get a surprise when you either open your vote by mail ballot or show up on March 3rd and you want to vote for a presidential candidate, but you're no party preference. So if you want to get one of these ballots, you need to go on your county elections website, check things out, and you're going to need to request one ahead of time. But that's the primary rules in a nutshell, but it's just something to watch out for. We just kind of want to go over some of the resources where you can get nonpartisan voter information. So votesmart.org, vote411.org, easyvoterguide.org. So easyvoterguide.org is my personal favorite. I really like that one. It does a really good job of explaining what's on the ballot in easy to understand format. So kind of some drier ones is you can read the official voter guide. So voterguide.sos.ca.gov. So, the Secretary of State has the voter guide. It's got a wealth of information on there too. Another website, if you are in a Voters Choice Act county or you're curious about the Voters Choice Act, I strongly recommend you go to voterschoice.org. It's got great stuff on the Voters Choice Act. It's a really good resource.
And it's also updated with any new developments. I mean, they try and update it fairly regularly, so it's helpful for those counties that may be in the process of planning or thinking about it, just to get regular ongoing news on what's happening in your county.
And then the last plug to you is again for disabilityrightsca.org. We've got lots of resources for voters with disabilities. We have some toolkits for if you're looking to start a VAC or join one or you want to know more. We've got toolkits there. We also have a toolkit that's geared towards election officials that are starting a VAC. You can hand them a copy of that. There's also information on conservatorships and just the general rules for accessible voting. And also check out our YouTube channel. We made a video on remote accessible vote by mail, and we also have the video on vote centers that we made with Russell and Brian. And then we have another older video which is more about accessibility at polling locations. So we've been trying to make some good video content.
And it also has, also on our website, there's a link that goes to publications. And we have one on best practices for starting a VAC and sort of, things that are helpful tips and tools to if your county is starting to do that. And so that's helpful if you're wanting to sort of assist your county in doing some outreach to get more VAC members on your local VAC committee.
So we had a question on, to inform our community on the weirdness of the primary, which I like how you put it, in this, is there a fact sheet available? So there are resources on the Secretary of State's website on the primary. They're pretty good. And then also I recommend you look at your county elections office website for resources. And not to go too deep into the weeds, but there can be a couple differences at the county level. So, San Diego, they've got a good fact sheet that they've put out, but you also want to check with your county elections office. But it's a tough one to explain in a fact sheet too, that doesn't turn into like a choose your own adventure with meandering paths everywhere. So I've seen some resources that are pretty good and some that are pretty tough to follow. Just one other thing about I think Russell and Brian kind of talked about it is a lot of work to kind of get these VACs going and build community coalitions. But kind of once you get them running, the idea is that they kind of start to run on their own, and they kind of build up some momentum, which is really helpful too.
Yeah, and the great thing about the VACs too is if to get to try and sort of get as much perspective, it's really helpful to reach out to different service organizations. One of the things that I've really tried to stress is getting young representation, getting like college age representation, getting somebody who can maybe, if you have a good relationship with your paratransit folks, maybe get somebody from that organization to come and be a member. Or
they make great back members.
Yeah, because the thing that's really helpful is when you get to the point where you're trying to coordinate a lot of the things of like where drop boxes are going to go and where vote center locations are going to go, being able to have somebody who has a beat on the pulse of public transportation is really, really helpful. And so, and being able to have somebody who may be of the college-aged crowd who may have really good, a lot of experience doing social media and outreach and using a lot of the different social media platforms. That's really helpful to engage the community. So just making sure that you have this as wide sweeping representation as you can.
Also, if you're unsure if your county has a VAC or not, check their websites. Some websites are better than others. And also reach out to Gabe and I. We can let you know if your county has a VAC. In a handful of counties, they have VACs. They're just not meeting regularly, so they kind of need a jump start. And we're happy to help you with that.
Go ahead. And then we do have a few questions.
Oh, we do? Okay. I didn't see any questions.
Yes.
Okay.
So
Awesome.
Megan will help to facilitate that. And then this is Ali. And then I also have a question. I want to make sure that I understand fully so that I can inform everyone that I know. So
Sure.
Megan, go ahead.
Well,
Great. Thanks, Ali.
Megan, can I just add one little additional thing, and then I'll be quiet.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that a lot of people, you'll get the response when I've outreach to people and say, hey, you'd make a great VAC member. We'd love to have you on this county VAC. A lot of the responses that I get is, well, I don't know a lot about elections or election law or accessibility. That doesn't matter. You will learn first off, and then you're also surrounded by people who, if you're not sure about regulation or rule, we can share that with you. And so if you're interested and passionate and want to have a voice and have a say, contact your county elections office about.
That's a great point, Gabe. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
Megan, questions?
Perfect. Yeah, we have a few people who have their hands raised. So sure. Lauren, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your line. So please go ahead and ask the question you have for our panelists, Lauren. Okay. Anyways, it looks like Lauren got off the call, but we have a question again from Sheila. So Sheila, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, okay?
So first of all, what is the date by which one should register for the March election? And then I have a comment.
The easy, so Sheila, the easy answer, this is Paul, is you should be registered now.
Yeah, but what's the 30 days date or the 90 days date or wherever it's
so
supposed to be?
the kind of the big deadline now is if you're not registered within 14 days of the election, you're going to have to go register in person.
Okay.
So, I think
that's all I need. Okay, but the comment that I wanted to make is
sure.
Huzzah for the 18th century ink and parchment people. I cannot use remote access vote by mail because they've shoved print down our throats yet again. And I've made that comment to the SOS many times. And as a blind person who does not own a printer, and many of these RAVBM places will not let you use a public computer and do it, you can't do it if you don't own your very own printer.
Yeah.
Which is
I hear you, Sheila. There's some problems with the remote access, like you got to have a computer, you got to have a printer, and some of this is a compromise for security, but it's not. It's good for some people with disabilities, but not everybody. So it's not perfect, Sheila.
And this is Ali. I'll ask my question. Well, actually, does anyone else have any questions for our panelists? Well, while you're mulling it over, I will ask mine. So let's say I am registered as no party preference. Do you have to request the crossover ballot before the election? Or can you request it if you go to once you arrive at your local polling place and or vote center?
You can still request it when you arrive, even on election day. So you can.
So the keywords are crossover ballot, correct?
You can. It's just ideally you'll have done it ahead of time. Just It'll take longer to vote in person. It's also, it is a burden too on the elections office because they have to process that vote a little differently. So you can still do it on election day, but it's recommended that you do it ahead of time.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you, Gabe and Paul. This was a lot of great information. I'm not seeing any other questions come through. If you do think of anything, you can go ahead and reach out to the Disability Organizing Network, and we can answer any questions or refer you to the people who might have that information at a later time. So we're going to go ahead and close out today's webinar. Once again, thank you to everyone who presented today. So Gabe and Paul, as well as Brian and Russell, and then Elizabeth Campbell Soper did a lot of work behind the scenes to get today's presentation up for everyone.